Hi, my name is Tim Ebata. I'm the Forest Health Officer at Resource Practices Branch here in Victoria. Today I'm going to talk to you about Youngstown Forest Health data. And here's my outline. So basically what kind of uh, Youngstown Forest Health data has been collected to date, how was it collected, where's the data being stored and accessed, how has it been used to date? And I'll provide a summary of my talk at the end and some questions. So the bottom line is detecting young um, forest health agents is hard. Although mortality is relatively easy to pick out because red dead trees stick out, um, trees that were dead for a while or not dead but are damaged, have sublethal damage or damage that just impacts form, is very difficult to detect using anything but ground surveys. Unless you have really high resolution um, remote sensing techniques, you will only pick up a small fraction of the damage. So some of the issues with the collection of this data is that the severity is difficult to document, which is important, and we'll talk about that later. It's difficult to identify the damage itself, so training is required. The distribution of the damage can often be clumped or patchy, so the survey method has to be rigorous enough to be able to pick up this damage. The damage also varies by layer, so little trees get impacted by a different cohort of things compared to taller, bigger trees. So the Forest Health program and also its predecessor, the CFS's FIDS survey, have collected young stand forest health data for a long time. Since the 60s, FIDS rangers used to collect forest health damage data using permanent sampling sites. Not necessarily PSPs or permanent sampling plots, but sites that they would revisit on a regular basis. They'd also do ad hoc surveys as directed by research scientists at the Pacific Forestry Center. The FIDS was contracted to do a passive young stand survey project uh, in the early 90s, funded by the federal and provincial FRDA, or Forest Resource Development Agreement funds. Um, and I can talk about that a little later. And also in 1986, forest health damage data collection was introduced into the whole free growing survey procedure because they basically needed to define what a healthy tree was. So you had to set up criteria to define what an unhealthy tree looks like. So with that, they collected data that would tally the amount of unhealthy trees. From 1980s to present, 40 years, forest health specialists have initiated several young stand surveys of various forms and types, mainly temporary sample plots and surveys, but they've also established permanent sample plots. Some healthy young stand surveys from the regions, if you go back into the history books and the records that we have, you'll see that we did a bunch of pixel surveys or strip surveys for root disease, both in the interior and the coast. We had spruce weevil surveys in certain coastal districts. There were general passive young stand surveys that were conducted under FRDA again in the Rupert region as well as in McBride Forest District. There were also pest-specific surveys. Warren's root collar weevil, the Kispiox TSA, it showed up as a potential issue, and surveys were done to investigate. There are many other examples that you can find in our records, um, and some of these are documented in the Forest Health Surveys Guidebook, as well as some of the internal reports that are posted on our FTP site. The barriers to use this old data, you have to remember that most of these surveys were limited to very specific areas or pests. They generally weren't adopted provincially, so there was no standardization. The numbers of samples were highly variable depending on the resources available. So, you know, to provide TSA level inference is quite difficult because the sampling was either um, biased to certain types of stand types or focused on a problem area rather than getting a complete inventory of a TSA. So each sampling effort was for different purposes. So sampling designs were also variable, as well as the target populations. The definition of the target populations were different. So most of these surveys were point in time incident surveys. So they really can't be used to look at time trends unless you redo the same survey in the same manner. Um, but again, these procedures are quite difficult to nail down. But you can get a general sense of at the time what the conditions were. One of the issues that we've had in forest health for many years is that we don't have a forest health database per se. So there's no real central repository of this data. But should we actually spend the time trying to resurrect it or sift through it? That's a question we're putting out there. So the current efforts to collect young stand forest health data, most of the young stand data we're collecting comes from free growing surveys, which are done by licensees uh, using a particular procedure and standard. And this data is stored in the silviculture database results. It has the maximum coverage because 100% of the managed stands that were logged and replanted have to be surveyed by licensees to relieve them of their obligation. So we got 100% coverage of a certain cohort of stands. So as the stands get older, post-free growing, we've always had this question of about what are the health of these stands and how are they developing as we had projected they would based on our growth and yield modeling, as well as understanding that forest health damaging agents seem to show up much later in the stand's development, post-free growing. So two survey methods were initiated. The Forest and Range Evaluation Program Stand Development Monitoring program was set up. There's two different protocols. The earliest version 1, and version 2, which came in later. I'll have a table that shows more detail. But the version 1 data, some of it ended up in results. There were 650 openings that were sampled. So the focus was on managed stands. And the protocol that version 2 was later modified to emulate was the young stand monitoring protocol that the Forest Analysis and Inventory branch is using to evaluate their GY or growth and yield projections to see if they are on the right track. They've already installed 1,300 of these permanent sample plots. The distribution of these plots is on a 20-kilometer grid, where the grid intersection points, if they fall on a specific site, they will be sampled using the YSM protocol. If they're young, if they're old, they're sampled with CMI plot methodologies. Here is a table that just outlines all the different types of pesky young stand surveys. FIDS, as I was describing earlier, temporary sample plots, basically stripped plots and fixed radius plots. SPY, which was developed by the Kamloops Forest region and still being used by the Thompson Okanagan region, was designed to be aligned with TSR, SDM, again, one, two versions. 2011, 2017 were the dates of those versions, and then YSM. and YSM being the only permanent sample plot. All of them collect incidence information and the severity. Some of them have severity thresholds, which is quite the same as severity per se. So free growing surveys, uh, most extensive, as I was saying, every stand that meets a certain age and age criteria will be sampled. So it's mandatory. So basically, we collect healthy tree and unhealthy tree information, and more details on how that data is used will be discussed by Dan Turner and Dave Waddell. So one of the things that I pointed out here is that although the severity thresholds were the best approximation at the time, they're not perfect, and we had made an assumption at the time that we would be setting up PSPs to monitor whether or not these criteria were legitimate or they reflected the true impact of that pest agent at the time. And unfortunately, that accompanying PSP project never materialized. So other recent Healthy Young Stand surveys, we have pest-specific surveys conducted for stem rust, looking more at how these stem rusts are impacting certain TSAs that have been identified as, I guess, rust-prone areas. The foliar diseases, there's some specific surveys looking at Swiss needle cast, because this is a new and up-and-comer in coastal Douglas fir stands. And balsam woolly adelgid, there was a occurrence survey looking at the distribution of this invasive insect that was thought to be only on the coast, but was recently found in the southern interior, and its range has now been found to be all the way into the caribou. So where is the data? The free growing data, as I was saying, was stored in results, but it requires a specific query and methodology to understand how to get the data out and what the data means. The SDM1 summaries, as saying, are available in a written format from Resource Practices Branch. The data itself, some of it's in results. SDM2 summaries are still pending. We're still waiting for some of the more recent SDM data to be analyzed. Same as YSM. YSM has a huge amount of data. It's being compiled by FABE right now. Ad hoc survey reports, there are some from the regions and online in some of our annual reports, which you can see on our website. And again, there's no corporate database containing all of the survey information, mainly because it's not standardized. And to do that would be a huge task. So where is all this old survey data? Who knows? I suspect they're in boxes, filing cabinets, floppy disks, old reports. And yeah, as people retire, that information is lost to history. So how is the data used? Primarily, this data collects incidents. So that's essentially the number of stems or the percent of the host that's been damaged, and also provides a severity of the damage. An example would be the percent girdling by, say, animals or stem rust, or the degree of deflection of a crook caused by a terminal weevil, percent defoliation by a defoliating insect or a foliar disease. The Hawksworth scale is used for just a standard scale used for mistletoe, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the problems is that incidence and severity doesn't necessarily mean impact. So again, more speakers will address this, but yield impact really per stem really is translated to a volume deduction at rotation, which is where we really care from a timber supply perspective. There are some huge research questions which I'd like to flag here, looking at this linkage between the incidence and severity data we collect today to the impact at rotation. And the impact can also be in the form of the tree and the quality of the wood that's being produced. This quality issue is not really factored into the TSR process. They make a lot of assumptions about that the products produced, or the grade of the wood that is being produced from the trees being grown and in these new forests will be saw logs, but what is the proportion of pulpwood? So we don't really know. Products from the survey data to date have been synthesized to produce hazard and risk ratings for priority forest health agents. You'll see these in the form of CETAs and MAPs, a CETA being a Stand Establishment Decision Aid, which was produced by Forex. These documents are on our website as well. Stocking standards guidance, you'll see that specific footnotes relating to things like spruce weevil and stem rust, etc., relate to what should be recommended for planting, what's an acceptable species, and also what stocking there should be to address that particular forest health risk. We have operational adjustment factors specifically for root disease and stem rust that are used during TSR to adjust the yield projections. We also have practice guidance originally put into our forest practice code guidebooks, but they have evolved into updated guidebooks as well as other guidance pieces throughout that are found throughout the ministry. We also have been guiding providing guidance to firm to direct their resistance breeding program, so they can identify what are the top priorities for resistance breeding. We also have various models that have been developed to date to attempt to simulate and project the impacts of various insects and diseases. Driven crime model you'll hear more about. Root disease as well, particularly armillaria in the southeast. There was a model developed based on Dr. Rennie L. Farrow's destructive sampling work on Sitka spruce that traced the fate of weevil attacks to rotation, and that went into a TAS submodel. And western spruce budworm impacts were developed into were addressed by a model called Bud Light, which was developed originally by the U.S. Forest Service for FBS, and then BC Prognosis is the BC version of that model. So moving forward, we need to improve the utility of the forest health data we collected that we collect now, and if possible, from past survey efforts. Go through the collection of old data and see what's worth carrying on or reevaluating, but also looking at the current data and getting more out of it. We need to determine priorities for data collection and analysis. So what are the key management questions we need to answer from the data? Are we collecting the right data? And if we need new or enhanced surveys, what is actually required and how much it will cost to implement them, and also administer the data. So really we need a forest health data management strategy and an implementation plan to flesh all this out. And of course, where are we going to get the resources? That's the million-dollar question. So in summary, many young stand forest health surveys have been conducted over the 4 decades of the provincial forest health program, and even earlier under FIDS. Nearly all collected incidence information as baseline, some with severity. The sampling methods and sampling intensity, coverage, duration have been highly variable, so it's difficult to use the data. And the resulting information inference from this data, as I was saying, has also been variable, but it's the only available estimate for estimating the distribution of and potential risk and impacts of these young stand forest health agents. Also, there's only a fraction of the data that's been collected to date is accessible to a wider audience for further analysis. So we do need a young stand forest health data strategy or forest health data strategy period um, to set priorities for data collection, storage, retrieval, and analysis, so that moving forward we will be able to collect the right data um, for the purposes that we've identified. So some questions that I'd like to pose that we can bring up in the breakout sessions. Can and should we make the old forest health data from these Healthy Young Stands surveys accessible? Is it worth the effort? So what are the key data gaps that you know of, and what are the priorities to fill those gaps? And lastly, can we improve the utility of the current province-wide survey data collection efforts? Free growing surveys, the YSM, SDM programs, and also the existing GY or growth and yield, as well as genetics plots and maybe even research plots. Can we get more forest health information from these? So thanks for listening, and there's my contact information if you need to get a hold of me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion at the breakout group. Thanks a lot.